So we turn now to a story of survival, strength and activism. This week marks 7 years since the Parkland school shooting, when 17 students and staff were killed by a former student. It ignited a wave of protests and bipartisan legislation. It's the subject of a new documentary, Death by Numbers, and it's nominated for an Oscar, which looks at the journey of one survivor, Sam Fuentes. For the last 5 years, gun violence has been the leading cause of death for children and teens in the US, and school shootings have seen stark increases over that time. There have been 4 this year already. Sam Fuentes and the film's director, Kim A. Snyder, join Hari Srinivasan against the reality of a Trump executive order which is aimed at rolling back gun control measures.
Sam Fuentes and Kim Snyder, thanks so much for joining us. Sam, you are a survivor of a horrific day in American history that unfortunately is too common, and it was the shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. And I wondered, you in this film are somebody who is not just speaking as a survivor, but really almost as a voice of a generation here that has been impacted so devastatingly by gun violence. And I'm wondering, first, I guess, how are you doing now?
What a thoughtful question. I think, especially as the anniversary approaches, it's always tough, I think especially with the symptoms of PTSD, like even in my everyday life, it still impacts me. There's not really a day where I'm not sort of thinking about that day and all of my community and how tough it is for them. And, but overall, I think because I'm very much engaged with my own trauma and I've worked through it a lot through therapy and even through just like written word, that's been very empowering for me overall.
Your words are kind of a frame for this whole film. I mean, whether it's your journal entries or however it is that you chose to express yourself, was that part of this, I guess, trajectory of healing?
I think so. For my own and personal experience, I think I've been writing my entire life, and it's always been something of a coping mechanism. It's an outlet for escapism. And so I think in terms of my own healing, writing has always been by my side. And for it to not be included in this story would be very odd, actually, because Death by Numbers was actually conceived through a larger piece of work that I wrote by the same name.
I think being able to directly address him is just another form of justice, because he affected my life in not just a literal, physical way, but in a psychological and mental and emotional way that will be everlasting. And I didn't get to choose that. So if I get to choose anything, it will be this.
Kim, how did you figure out to tell this story at this time? And then really, how did Sam's work, everything kind of integrate together into this film?
Sure. Well, it emanated in a sense. I've been in this space with a longtime producer, Maria Cuomo-Cole, and I had done a film called Newtown back in, got released in 2016, about that horrific day we all can't forget of the kids at Sandy Hook. And we became immersed in that space, and some happenstance landed us to tell the story of Sam and her classmates as the story of activism that grew up in response to her shooting. And then there was this next story that I couldn't let go of, that really was about Sam moving through the trial of her shooter and trying to reclaim her power in confronting him. And that was a story I felt hadn't been told, and that was important both in terms of really raising awareness about youth trauma in our country and the fallout for our youth, and also in her bravery in just standing up to hate that goes for me beyond guns or even the borders of our own scourge of idiosyncratic, horrible gun violence in the United States.
If it's not too difficult for you, and perhaps we can do a little bit of justice to not thinking about this shooting as just a set of numbers. Can you tell me a little bit about maybe one of the friends that you lost and you still think about?
Of course. A friend of mine who I'd known since English English freshman year was Nick Dworet, who was unfortunately killed beside me in my Holocaust studies class. He was excellent. I mean, he was smart, handsome, who's one of our best swimmers at our school, arguably in the state. You know, we always said that he was going to make it to the Olympics. And something about him always just made you laugh and made you feel comfortable. He was the kind of person where he was outgoing and charismatic, but didn't have an ego about it. And I miss him all the time. And I know his parents miss him all the time. His family misses him all the time. And there's not a day that goes by that we're not thinking about, you know, the legacy of the 17 people that we lost.
Kim, I want to ask, your active choice to include so much of the trial in this film, including the decision to blur out the shooter's face every time the audience might see him. Why did you do those things?
Well, that was a collective decision between Sam and myself. We were definitely collaborators on all of these things. And we felt it was important to be in keeping with something a lot of survivor communities have called no notoriety, that we know there's evidence of copycatting. We don't want to glorify these shooters, as Sam pointed out so boldly in her statement to him that he would never get the fame he was seeking. You know, rather than actually blurring, there is this idea of Xing, you know, derived from the idea of Sam's journal, her thoughts. And it was important that we not give him that notoriety, but we did make a choice at the very end when she finally takes the agency to finally look him in the eye herself, that is the one time that we decided she gets to decide when he should be stared down and called out.
I assure you, you will not be famous for this. I assure you that our people will be accounted for, they'll grow and heal despite you. You have no power anymore. You have no future. You have nothing. The people that you killed will have a legacy much more important than you. And the people who nearly killed will live their lives, though with much difficulty, with a compassion and a dignity in ways you will only dream.
I mean, it was an incredibly powerful statement, and I wonder what it was like to prepare it, to deliver it. Did it help get that out off your chest?
I think overall, it's one of those ultimatums that I'll look back in my life, which is, do I confront the person who committed this terrible atrocity and speak my truth to power, or do I live for the rest of my life knowing I didn't do that? And so I think with this one opportunity, the decision was really obvious to me. And I knew that people like him wanted fear, he wanted rage, he wanted you to completely lose control in his presence. He wanted to know that you still feared him. And I know to a certain degree, and forgive me for phrasing it this way, but they get off on stuff like that. And even though I knew it would be frightening, and I was frightened and just sort of mortified altogether, I knew that I had to approach it in a way that was with restraint and with respect and with dignity, because he wanted to see me suffer and he wanted to continue that sort of reign of terror. And I knew that confronting him was a lot larger than myself. It was for my community. It was for everything that we had lost. It was for even just a larger declaration of pointing him out for the person he was and speaking truth about him. I think he represents sort of this larger issue at play. And that's why I knew that despite the fear and despite the sort of anxiety that I had surrounding this day, I needed to do it. And I think that's what sort of kept me calm, was I knew I had my whole community behind me. And it's one of those things that I think when I look back in my life, I can say with great confidence that I did the right thing.
The shooter did not get the death penalty. He was sentenced to life behind bars. And I wonder, did you have any initial response? How you felt about it then? Has that changed over time?
It's still something that I feel very uncertain about. I knew that as far as a position in the film, the death sentence was sort of never really important to us, because I understood and was also feeling that I don't think that either sentence would have brought closure and complete and absolute justice for our community. Grief and trauma are incredibly divisive, and everyone has a unique sort of experience and interpretation of their own loss. And I think the trial overall was very cruel and very unusual in the sense that it re-traumatized our entire community, and took up so much time and so many resources, and was just also in general, a lot of the conduct was a disgrace. So the sentence wasn't really so important to me at the end of the day.
Kim, this is not your first film about school shootings. I mean, this is a topic that you talk about a lot. I mean, I did an interview 4 years ago about bus kids, also focused on the response after this horrible attack. I'm unfortunately one of the reporters that went and sat in the living room of some of the survivors of the Newtown shooting. And I thought at that time, this is definitely a line too far. Something will happen in this country, right? And here I am, and there were 39 school shootings last year. And I don't think they're going to stop this year. And I wonder how, as you continue to work in this, as you continue to try to tell these painful stories, what does this background in America make you think?
Well, as you said, it's on one hand incredibly demoralizing. My relationships with some of those same families have endured for over a decade now, and they're very close. And I think once you become close, you can't relent. You just sort of can't turn your back on joining forces, because they don't relent, and they're so courageous. The communities that I have observed, like those in Newtown, in Sam's community, the youth that rose up, are, we now see it in Uvalde. They're so determined not to relent in honor of those slain. And sadly, that club that no one wants to belong to just grows bigger and bigger. So on one hand, it's incredibly demoralizing, especially in these last weeks. We just came back from Sundance, and it's a time where a lot of the work of Sam and her colleagues, the work that they did to get the age raised to 21 has now been revoked. We see some real disappointing movements in that way. But on the other hand, since that time of Newtown, I always say that the voices of new messengers have gotten stronger. I have a teacher friend in Newtown who survived that, who's started a whole new group, Teachers United Against Gun Violence. We've seen law enforcement step up. We've seen doctors who felt they would have been fired back then, younger doctors who are not keeping quiet. We see clergy. That gives me some heart, and it's mostly the youth, because they are not. One of Sam's colleagues, David Hogg, was just elected as a vice chair of the DNC. I have faith that they will not relent, and they have a lot of years. So my pessimism and optimism is like any movement. I have faith in them that something will take hold. And I think right now the biggest hope short term is behavioral changes, and stories like this and voices like Sam. The best I can do is to continue to believe that they pierce through the numbness. We can't stop reminding people. We can't just accept it, and we can't become a society just that accepts that this is the number one killer of youth. We owe it to them to do better.
Sam, just the other day online, I saw someone that essentially used what happened at your school as, in his own brain, justification for why there should be more guns in schools, in the hands of teachers and everyone else. And I know that you've now engaged in this topic for quite some time. What do you see as any sort of a solution? What are steps that this country can take to try to decrease the volume of these tragedies?
It's a great question. I absolutely believe that a lot of preventative action, in the most obvious sense, can be seen through legislation. But I know that in the next coming years, we're going to see a lot of these gun laws on mostly state levels, but also on federal levels, sort of be rolled back on. I think bills and legislation are obviously what everyone thinks is the first sort of action that we can take. This looks like universal background checks. This looks like raising the age from 18 to 21, which was something we actually saw in the state of Florida and we're rolling back on. Red flag laws, safe storage laws, things of that sort of nature, saves lives. But what I need to make very clear is that gun violence sort of is an umbrella and impacts America in so many different ways. 60% of it is suicide, which is to say that because it is a multifaceted issue, we have to sort of approach it in sort of various different strategies and angles. And so in addition to, laws are important, but having safe reporting systems, in schools and such is also important for kids to see an issue and can report children is huge. Having, resources like mental health services and counselors and after school programs to sort of keep violence and out of schools and the visibility of the health and the well-being of our communities is also huge. We see this through a lot of grassroots efforts with cities that have programs that sort of invest in de-escalations of violence, as well as providing resources to communities that are more prone or targeted to gun violence. We have to advocate for laws on the big front, on Federal Hill, on our state laws, but we also have to be mindful of our own communities and engage in conversations with our neighbors, as well as, support programs that, keep the visibility of our people up and the well-being of them up so that there's less reasons to turn to violence in the first place.
Filmmaker Kim Snyder and writer and survivor Sam Fuentes. The film is called Death by Numbers. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Now to Texas, where a new redistricting plan, backed by Republicans, is causing a political standoff. Critics accuse them of a partisan power grab as they look to gerrymander more safe seats ahead of the next congressional election. So say the Democrats, many of whom left the state in an attempt to stall this proposal. State Representative James Tallarico joins Michelle Martin to explain why.
Thanks, Christiane. Representative Tallarico, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
So you've got the Texas flag behind you, but you're not actually in Texas. Do you mind telling us where you are?
We're in the state of Illinois. We're trying to be careful because of security concerns. As I'm sure you've reported, President Trump has threatened to send the FBI to come find us. Governor Abbott has threatened to remove us from our duly elected positions in the legislature. And then Ken Paxton, our Attorney General in Texas, sent out a tweet to his thousands of followers asking them to, quote, hunt us down. And so because of all that, we've received a lot of threats, including multiple bomb threats.
Yeah, I heard that there were bomb threats at the place where you were staying. But so when did the idea of breaking quorum, of leaving the state in order to deny the Republicans a quorum, first emerge? How did that happen?
Well, it was when we first started seeing reporting that the president was going to ask Texas Republicans to redraw our political maps in the middle of the decade. Typically, this is done at the beginning of a decade after a new census. That's exactly what happened in Texas in 2021. And once we heard that they may try to rig these maps in the middle of the game so that the president doesn't have to face accountability in the midterms, we knew we may have to take some dramatic actions to protect the democratic process, not just in Texas, but across the country. And so this is, we're not fighting for just Democrats. We're fighting for independents and Republicans, too. This is about whether or not the people, all of us, can change our government from the bottom up, whether we can hold powerful people, including the most powerful man in the country, accountable.
This isn't exactly easy. You got to leave whatever job you have that, the Texas legislature is not, full time. So you have other things to do. You have family members. It's not easy on people's lives. So I just was curious about what were some of the conversations that you had in the caucus about, whether this was the right thing to do or not?
Yeah, it was certainly not a decision we made lightly. As you mentioned, many of my colleagues are leaving behind young children. Some of them are leaving behind aging parents. We're all leaving behind our day jobs, which is how we make ends meet and pay our bills. But we know that this is a lot bigger than us. It's a lot bigger than any one politician or any one political party. This is about whether or not people can elect the representatives of their choice, which is the most fundamental part of this representative democracy. And so we felt like we had to take a stand. And thankfully, we, over the past week, I think have really focused the country's attention on this power grab in Texas. I know that the Google searches for gerrymandering and redistricting are through the roof, which, as a former teacher, that makes my heart happy that people are using this opportunity to learn about our broken political system. And hopefully it sparks a conversation about how to fix this democracy going forward so that it works for everybody.
The Republicans control the governor's office. They control all the top state offices, both United States senators, the attorney general, the governor, et cetera, and both houses of the legislature. OK, but in 2021, Democrats did the same thing to deny Republicans a quorum. That was not perceived as a success. Do you disagree with that assessment? I mean, the bill that you were trying to stop passed anyway. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I would disagree with that assessment, that analysis. When we broke quorum in 2021, it was over a voter suppression bill. And I should say this quorum break and that quorum break, those are the only two quorum breaks in 20 years in Texas. So this is not a common occurrence because of the tremendous cost, financial, personal, political, legal. It's not something that should be undergone without a lot of thought and without a lot of justification. It's an extreme tool that the minority has in our toolbox, and it's protected by the Texas state constitution. And so we're not breaking any laws. We're not doing anything that's not in the House rules. And it's why it's so strange that people are threatening us with arrest and with vacating our seats, because there's a long tradition in Texas and in America. We're here in the land of Lincoln. Abe Lincoln broke quorum as a state senator back in 1840 by jumping out of a window at the Illinois state capitol. So this is a time-honored tradition, and it's not something that we undergo lightly. And so to answer your question, that last quorum break in 2021 over the voter suppression bill, while it didn't kill the bill, it did put a national spotlight on the issue, which pressured our Republican colleagues to take the worst parts out of that bill. A ban on souls to the polls, which is Sunday morning voting, when a lot of African-American churches take their members to have their voices heard in the democratic process. That was taken out of the bill. A provision that would have allowed Republicans in our state to overturn election results that they didn't like, that was taken out of the bill, all because of our quorum break and the attention that it galvanized across the nation.
But, the governor is threatening to try to find a way to vacate your seats so that he can then appoint people to replace you, calling on the FBI, which, of course, Republicans do control now, to go and bring you in, as it were. They're talking about deputizing, the Texas Rangers to somehow cross state lines, which they do not have the authority to do at present. And then they're also talking about, I don't know how this would work, but charging you with bribery if you use any campaign funds to subsidize the costs of this, sort of experience. Do any of those, in your estimation, have any legal force at all?
No. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm a former public school teacher, but I've got a lot of colleagues who are very talented lawyers. And we've brought on a team of lawyers to help us given these threats. All of them agree that the legal theories underpinning these threats are laughable. That doesn't mean they won't succeed. I mean, our courts are highly politicized, especially in Texas. And so we'll see if it works. But if we're just going by rule of law, I think these should be laughed out of court. And I think it's equally laughable that Ken Paxton, the most corrupt politician in Texas, perhaps the most corrupt politician in the country, is accusing us of bribery when he was literally impeached on a bipartisan basis in the Texas House of Representatives for his corruption and for enriching himself and his donors. So this is hypocrisy at the highest level. And I think it's important to realize that this redistricting attempt, this power grab, is corrupt too. We oftentimes think of corruption as just involving money. That is certainly one kind of corruption, but corruption is the abuse of power. It's the betrayal of the public trust. And this is corruption at the highest level.
So talk about the maps then. It's not exactly a secret what their objective is. I mean, their objective is, at the request of the president, he was very clear about this too, to redraw the lines to give Republicans the advantage, or so they believe, in 5 additional seats. And that would mean consolidating seats that are currently held by Democrats, or just basically redrawing the lines. And even the Supreme Court has ruled that you can't redistrict along racial lines. Their argument is that this isn't racial at all. This is partisan, and that that's perfectly allowed. What do you say about that?
Well, one, I would disagree that this is not racial gerrymandering. You take a look at these maps and the communities they divide, the voices they dilute. It is primarily Black and brown. It is African-American communities, and it's Latino communities across the state of Texas, 2 growing populations in our state that they are disenfranchising with this racist and discriminatory gerrymandering. But I also want to point out how crazy it is that they seem to be very okay admitting publicly that this is a naked political power grab. That may be legal, but it is certainly not moral. It is certainly not supported by the vast majority of Americans. There was polling data released earlier this week showing that this power grab in Texas is wildly unpopular across the state of Texas, including among Trump supporters, because no one likes cheating. No one likes rigging an upcoming election. People should be evaluated on their policies and their record. And if those policies are unpopular, then you should face consequences as an elected official, regardless of your political party. And unfortunately, the president has been embroiled in corruption, receiving planes from a foreign government. He's kicking millions of people off their health care to fund tax breaks for billionaires. And those policies and those actions are unpopular. And as the most powerful man in the country, he needs accountability. He needs to face consequences at the ballot box, not just for all of us, but for him. That will make him a better president. So even if you're a Trump supporter, him facing accountability in the next election will make him a better leader for all of us. And I hope we all want that, regardless of how we feel about the president.
It's interesting that your Governor Abbott, Greg Abbott, in a number of his interviews particularly with the conservative media, it has to be said, his argument is that the Democrats who are cheating by leaving the state. He says that Texans stay and fight. And that you're abdicating your responsibility, but it's also that you're the ones who are not willing to stay and fight and argue it out. What would you say to that?
Well, we're not running away from a fight. We're running into the fight. We're running to the front lines of this fight and taking on a lot of risk to do it. We're the ones facing threats, including threats of violence. And Greg Abbott's in his fancy mansion surrounded by security detail. So you tell me who is more courageous in this fight. And I'll just say again that we are taking on all this risk so that we can fight for the people. I think there's a stark moral difference here. Greg Abbott and Texas Republican politicians are willing to disempower the people of Texas to protect their positions. Texas Democrats are willing to give up our positions to empower the people of Texas. That is the starkest contrast that you can draw. And I'm happy to have the people of our state judge us on those merits.
The other argument that people are making, and I've heard this again in the conservative media, is that the Democrats have left for states that are themselves heavily gerrymandered, that have an historic, there's an historic precedent in many of these states for substantially gerrymandered districts, which happen to favor Democrats. So what would you say to that?
I've condemned those maps, including the one here in Illinois. Gerrymandering is wrong, whichever party does it, in whatever part of the country it's done. We have to get gerrymandering out of our politics. And, Democrats in Congress, when they had the majority, they tried to pass a ban on partisan gerrymandering for the whole country, in red states and blue states. And every single Republican in Congress voted against that ban. But gerrymandering is a bipartisan problem and it has to end. All I want to say is that what's happening here in Texas is a whole nother level of corruption and rigging of the system. It's being done in the middle of the decade, and it's being done at the direct request of the most powerful man in the country. And if people can't understand how that is a lot more dangerous than typical gerrymandering, then I think we've got work to do to help people wake up to what's happening in their name, in their government, because these politicians are trying to pick their voters instead of voters picking their politicians. And if we walk down that road, I'm worried about where it leads.
And speaking of walking down that road, Democrats in some states like California and New York are saying it's time to fight fire with fire. Governor Newsom in California, Governor Hochul in New York is saying, okay, Texas, if you're going to go down that road, we're going to try to amend our state constitutions to do something similar. And some of them say this with regret, but others say, it's about time. What do you say about that?
Well, I think that word "if" is very important. This should only be done in self-defense. I do not support any preemptive gerrymandering in blue states. I only think this should happen if Texas Republicans go through with this power grab and cheat before the upcoming election. If that happens, then all bets are off. And the Democratic Party cannot unilaterally disarm. You stop a bully by standing up to them, by looking them right in the eye and not blinking. And that's exactly what Democrats need to do if the bullies go forward with their plan in Texas.
You've actually introduced an independent redistricting commission bill in every session since 2021. And I'm just wondering, why do you think that idea doesn't have more appeal?
Because this is not an issue of party, it's an issue of power. The people in power want to hold on to power. It's a tale as old as time. And this is one of the ways they do it, by gerrymandering. Again, in both political parties, they draw these maps into these crazy shapes to manufacture the outcome they want, to insulate themselves from the will of the public. Again, nothing could be more un-American, nothing could be more undemocratic than that. And it is what leads to extremism in our politics. My constituents often ask me why we at the state legislature aren't focused on funding schools, making neighborhoods safer, expanding access to healthcare, lowering property taxes. Why do we focus on all this crazy culture war stuff? And I tell them redistricting, gerrymandering. When you have deep red seats and deep blue seats, and that's all you don't have swing seats anymore, then the only competition for a politician is in their primary, because the general election is predetermined. And so when the only competition is in your primary, that means the people you have to please are your farthest, most extreme flank of your base. True for Republicans and true for a lot of Democrats. And that is why you see such extremism in our political discourse. Gerrymandering is the rot at the core of our broken political system, and we have to ban it everywhere in all states.
The question for you as a Democrat is, how are you so sure that most of the people in the state don't agree with the Republicans? I think that what they're doing is just fine. How do you know?
And that may be true. Texas got more competitive. I remember when I was growing up in Texas, Democrats lost statewide by 25, 30 points. Now we consistently lose by only single digits. And Joe Biden in 2020 against Donald Trump, it was a 5-point gap in our state. So Texas is not this deep red state that a lot of people think it is. We're much more of a pink state right now, trending toward purple. You had mentioned earlier that we're a small minority in the Texas legislature. That's actually not true. The only reason we can break quorum is because we're such a large minority, where we control about 42, 43% of the seats in the lower chamber. If we were a tiny minority, we couldn't break quorum because we wouldn't have enough members to halt business on the floor. And so I would say to your question, that we should all be trying to compete for these votes, and I think that is true for Republicans too. And I don't think you'd be trying to cheat if you felt like you were going to win the next election.
So, what would victory look like for you at the moment? Do you see any movement here? Do you see any possibility that there might be I don't know, a meeting of the minds that would allow you to come home?
I mean, I hope for that. I pray for that. But I am planning, and my colleagues and I are planning for if that doesn't happen. One, I think the public backlash has been overwhelming, again, across the political spectrum, and that's a good thing. Second, I think you're seeing these blue states with trifectas moving toward retaliation. I'm hopeful that that will convince my Republican colleagues and President Trump to walk back from the brink. Because what we don't want is a national tit for tat descending spiral of partisanship. We don't want that. I don't think anyone wants that. I certainly don't. And so my hope is that all of this pressure from the public, from blue states, all of it catalyzed by our quorum break, will put enough pressure on Republican politicians to do the right thing and walk us back from the edge.
Can you envision a day when people might actually return to something called regular order?
I do. I think that, history is a pendulum. And I do think 10 years of this Trumpian politics, this politics as blood sport, this where it feels more like professional wrestling than civic discourse. I do think people are getting tired of that. I think they see through it. I think they're ready for sincerity and honesty and hope again. I do think those traits are going to make a comeback. At least I hope so.
Texas State Representative James Tellerico, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me again.
Now turning to the White House, where a 73-year-old legal statute is being used to defend the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 was passed amid anti-communist fears during the early Cold War. Now, that period of history is the focus of the new book, Red Scare: Blacklist, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Author and reporter Clay Ryson joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss what past political hysteria tells us about the present.
Bianna, thanks. Clay Ryson, thanks so much for joining us. First, I guess for our audience that might not have paid attention in history class, the Red Scare, why did it happen? What was it? Just set the table for us.
Yeah, so the Red Scare was a period from roughly the end of World War II, 1946, went for about a decade, 1957, although it's hard to put dates on these things. But it was a period of rampant, sort of unchecked anti-communist hysteria. There was a real reason for it. Look, there was Soviet espionage in the United States. There was the Cold War, obviously, but it got out of hand in a pretty dangerous way and scary way, where even teachers and postal workers were being called into question for their loyalty to America.
So what were the kind of underlying tensions that made Americans want to believe that there was going to be, well, Soviet infiltration? We were literally allies with the Soviets. And why did it turn so quickly?
Yeah, well, I think there are two reasons. One is sort of a long simmering conflict between the progressive America that came out of the New Deal, an America that was oriented more toward a pluralist vision, very much embracing of women's rights and civil rights, but also an active government. And then on the other side, a conservatism that reacted very strongly against that for a variety of reasons, some of which were pretty conspiratorial. And that simmered for a long time. The Great Depression was on, Roosevelt was popular. And then, as you said, the war started and we were allies with the Soviet Union. But pretty immediately after that, things changed dramatically so that the Soviets became our Cold War enemies. But part of that message coming from President Truman and from Congress was that this war has to be fought domestically as well, that we have an obligation to be 100% security minded. And so anyone who even has the iota of possible questions about their loyalty, they have to be excluded from eventually from society, not just from sensitive jobs, but we saw people kicked out of teaching jobs, of not giving fishing licenses because they were, suspect in some way. I mean, it got out of hand in ways that are funny or would be funny if they weren't so scary.
Yeah. So what was the kind of domino effect? I mean, it sometimes when you look back in history in hindsight, you say, well, how did these people let all of these things happen? But was there kind of an incremental increase or I should say decrease in the civil liberties? What happened?
Yeah, there absolutely was. One of the things that happened very early on is President Truman, who did not really believe in the threat of Soviet espionage as a big threat. He knew that there were spies, but he didn't think that it was a problem. And he didn't think the communists were about to take over the country. But because of that, he thought he could sort of essentially buy off FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, buy off his critics in Congress with what was termed a loyalty program, where they essentially investigated anyone who wanted a job in the federal government and anyone who worked in the federal government. But the process was very poorly constructed. And very quickly, people were being hounded for tiny little blips and anonymous tips that would come into the FBI. Ultimately, tens of thousands of people were thoroughly investigated. And this had a knock-on effect with the rest of society, because as soon as the president said, this is of such concern that we're going to check everybody, then other industries followed suit. And very importantly, a lot of political opportunists saw the moment and used this fear that was boiling up as a way to go after their enemies, to raise their own profile. Ultimately, Joe McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, is the best example of this and lent his name to the era. But there were many other people like him, both before and during his reign of terror.
I wonder, this was in the living lifetimes of so many people who had just witnessed what happened in Nazi Germany, with people turning on each other, being asked and incentivized to turn in their neighbors, right? But it's like, we think about that as like some sort of bygone era. We clearly read about it in the history books. We're talking about a decade and a half or less.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is important to keep in mind when we think back from our present moment, or maybe recent past, is how fragile civil liberties are, and how willing people are to trade some civil liberties for the promise of security. And, obviously Nazi Germany is an extreme example of that. But I think in America, a lot of people saw it as a trade-off. It wasn't that they were willing to give up all civil liberties, but maybe the civil liberties of some people, maybe some of their own civil liberties, because they were being told that this was this overwhelming threat, that there were communists all over the United States who were poised to take over.
The second half of the book title is The Making of Modern America. So what were the consequences? What are the kind of long-term impacts that the Red Scare had in shaping the America that we live in today?
Yeah, I think there are a couple. I mean, one is that it really put in place the left-right divide that we know today. It didn't create it. It had already been there, but it gave this sharp underline to this idea that the left is always going to be suspect for certain things that it may or may not have done, affiliation with radicalism. And it also created on the right a certain often fringe element that trafficked in conspiracy theories, was not just opposed to big government, but truly believed that the government was evil. And so while there was always, there's bipartisanship and healthy competition in the middle for decades after, there was always this undercurrent of tension and that popped up occasionally, whether it was under, the Goldwater movement or Buchanan in the 90s. So I think that's an important context. But the flip side is that we also, at least for a period, reasserted our commitment to civil liberties. And I think a lot of the achievements of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s and the women's rights movement and various other pushes for equality and for civil liberties came out of the experience of the Red Scare and a commitment, at least on parts of the left, to make sure that we didn't go back to that.
Even just in reading your book, I was several times kind of surprised by how these sort of authoritarian and in some ways fascist tendencies wrap themselves in the American flag. I mean, the idea of a House Un-American Committee is so un-American that on its face, right? But you're just like, what? How did we believe that this was the key to becoming more American, is to act less like Americans?
Yeah, well, I think there's always been a strain of thinking, particularly on the right, of what Americanism is, right? And it's always debatable. It's always debated. But there is this line about a sort of purity of thought, purity of belief and association, and that the values that are inherent in the Constitution and often celebrated by many on the right, not all, but largely on the left, over dissent and over debate. These things are inherently difficult for some people to wrap their heads around when they have that kind of narrow commitment to Americanism. And so you find situations throughout modern American history when that perspective, that idea that there is one line to walk in terms of what Americanism is, when that's empowered, it becomes very easy to decide who stands outside from that.
A lot of people are looking at this book now and say, wow, it's an interesting history book, and they're finding it relevant in different ways with what's happening today. And I wonder if that is too much of a stretch, if they're right to be concerned and see these parallels. Are we projecting what we want on and want to use the word McCarthyism? What are some of the things that you've seen in the last month and a half or so that you might feel like, okay, this is an appropriate analogy, this is a reasonable parallel that we should be concerned about?
Every day I wake up and there is a news story that reminds me of something from that era from my book. And I hear from readers a lot. The book was not intended to be that way. None of this was, I don't have a crystal ball. I wouldn't be writing books if I did. But there are so many parallels, and some of them are superficial. Some of them are people deploying McCarthyite tactics here and there, which people have done for a long time. McCarthy showed what worked.
Others, so give me an example of that.
Well, so for example, I mean, just last year, Senator Vance, when he was senator, during the debate the sort of witch hunt around Haitian immigrants, refugees in Ohio who were supposedly eating dogs. And he was challenged with evidence showing that was not true. And he said, well, it doesn't really, I'm paraphrasing, he said, it doesn't really matter whether this or that accusation is true. The larger point is true, which is that immigration is a problem for the United States. And so, all of these falsehoods are in service of a higher truth. And that was an argument that McCarthy used all the time and his defenders used. He would say, well, maybe I got this accusation wrong against this person, but it's still true that there are communists in the government. And so I'm making mistakes, but I'm trying to get to the truth. And that's very dangerous, right? Because of course he never did find communists, but people let him do this because he claimed to be fighting for some higher truth. Now, but a lot of people use that tactic. I'm reminded, right now we have this issue, or at least in the legal community, you have a lot of large firms that are very worried about, defending clients who are accused of this or that by the Trump administration. They're afraid of speaking out. That happened all over the place during the Red Scare. Lawyers were very hard to find. If you were accused of being disloyal to the United States or accused of being a security risk, you could not just turn to your lawyer. You could not just go to any large firm. There were very few people who were willing to stand up and say, I will defend you. I will take this on, for the same reasons. They were afraid of losing clients. They were afraid of earning the attention of guys like Joe McCarthy.
So I wonder if there were turning points that you can identify now with the benefit of history that said, okay, this moment started to turn the tide, and then these two other moments really helped?
Yeah, I think, look, geopolitics had a big part to play. Joseph Stalin died in 1953, the same year the Korean War ended. The Cold War kind of, if it was simmering, it kind of went back to just being, a little calmer. And so people were willing, Americans could kind of relax a little bit. But it also mattered that throughout the Red Scare, people stood up. Not everybody, and oftentimes with great consequence. But the Hollywood 10 stood up to the House Un-American Activities Committee and went to jail for it. Dozens of other Americans did the same thing and went to jail. But it mattered over time that people stood up. Edward R. Murrow stood up to Joe McCarthy and very famously produced a documentary, a 30-minute show that helped tank McCarthy's popularity, showing that he was a bully and that there was nothing else there to him except that. Earl Warren, the Supreme Court justice, drove the court to systematically dismantle elements of the Red Scare, the tools, the architecture of the Red Scare. And while all of these didn't happen at the same time, it took time, it eventually helped remove the threat, sort of lower the fear. Yeah. And look, the House Un-American Activities Committee was around for a long time after that. Red baiting was a tactic throughout the 1960s, and I'd say continues to be today. But the fear was removed. And I think it took all of those different actors willing to stand up for it to finally come to an end.
So I wonder if, I'm a media nerd, probably like yourself as well, but is there the possibility of an Edward R. Murrow today, given that the landscape is so fragmented? Is there a moment that's possible, or individuals like that can have that kind of an impact, given that we live in these sort of filters and these our own ecosystems of consumption?
I think there is, but with this explanation, what Murrow understood was that McCarthy was a newspaper guy. McCarthy succeeded because he understood how the newspaper ecosystem worked. He understood that if he got a scoop to a journalist right before deadline, he could basically say anything he wanted because that journalist was going to essentially reprint it without checking it. But people never saw him live, or they never saw him in action. They always saw him, maybe a photograph, usually text. Murrow understood that TV would be different, that TV was something where he could just, and if you watch that documentary, it's phenomenal because it's basically just long clips of McCarthy without much commentary from Murrow. And essentially Murrow is saying, see, this is the guy. This is the person who has us all in thrall and fear. And doesn't he look like a bully? And it worked. So the analogy today is not one-to-one. But I think what I'd say is that if someone's going to come along and be that Edward R. Murrow, it's going to be someone who fundamentally understands the media ecosystem of today. And maybe it's not a journalist. Maybe it's an influencer. Maybe it's a politician. Maybe it's just someone who has something to say and it goes viral. It's hard to know, but I think that's what it's going to be. It's going to be someone who gets the moment in a way that nobody else does.
Seeing what you're seeing now and researching what you've researched, are you optimistic, pessimistic? Kind of where are you on seeing parts of history repeat itself?
I mean, I can look back optimistically and say, I see all these similarities between then and now. And I can also say, well, it ended. And it ended in part because the American people decided in a very, I mean, that's reductive, but eventually we came to our senses and said that civil liberties abuses are ridiculous. There's no communist threat. And you can see points in American history where this has happened. And so one could say, well, the present moment will chill out and damage will be done, but we'll get over it. This was Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower's fundamental belief is that Americans are pragmatic. They're not given to demagogues for a long period of time. So I can say that optimistically. Pessimistically, I can look at all the differences between, and I think this is one of the things that history is really important for. People look for parallels, but they also need to look for differences to say, here's why today is different than things we've experienced in the past. And I hope people who read the book will go through it and say, but now it's like this. Now the challenge to the legal community is coming from the president himself, and that changes the game. And that leaves me less optimistic, simply because I don't know how this ends, and I don't know if the will of the people will even matter when push comes to shove.
The book is called Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Author Clay Risen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Major news organizations, including ours, are calling on Israel to allow international journalists in and out of Gaza. Right now, the world depends on local journalists and humanitarians to get any information out. Israel so far has not budged, but an American journalist, Afif Nassouli, managed to get in, volunteering as a medical worker, and he spent his off hours reporting. He wrote about the suffering he saw in The Intercept, and here he is talking about that with Hari Srinivasan.
Christian, thanks. Afif Nassouli, thanks so much for joining us. One of the reasons that we have you on is it's very rare, at this point almost impossible, to get any first-line reporting out of Gaza. And you went there for 7 weeks, and you went as an aid worker, but you were kind of reporting on the side. In the last couple of weeks, logistics and aid delivery has come into the spotlight a bit more with the crisis of just starvation, access to food, however you want to put it, for the people of Gaza right now. So tell me, what were you able to see? Because what we are hearing is that the majority of Palestinians do not have enough food to eat and are in significant health risk of death.
Yeah, I saw this sort of escalate as I was there. The blockade started March 2nd. I was there by March 27th. By the time I was there, people were rationing and thinking about how to make sure they would have food if it got worse. And it was just getting worse. It was just the beginning at that time. So I experienced it as seeing 170 community kitchens dwindle and dwindle and dwindle until there were just dozens of them. And then I experienced volunteering at one that eventually had to close down and just had potatoes on June 1st, I remember, from some other organization. So you see this population getting emaciated. I had a friend who lost over 100 pounds in the last 2 years. I have a friend at 6 foot who's 119 pounds. People were just losing weight, and we were all just eating as little as we possibly could so that we could eat again tomorrow. Even I lost 10 to 12 pounds and got sick once because I was like subsisting on just a few calories, and I was also sick from something else, and I just couldn't sort of get through it. But it looks like a million things happening at once. It looks like doctors also operating on people that are skin and bones, because it's different for everybody. Everybody has a sort of a different privilege. But then when there's a blockade for months, you're all just, no one's privileged. There's this equal suffering happening. I remember people asking for tain or flour, and just having, being able to speak Arabic and telling them back that we don't have flour either. Like, just because I have this Glia vest on we just don't have flour either. And I was thankful that we could speak Arabic and that I was with Ghazawi colleagues, because it was so hard to see people struggling in the streets and begging on the level, and with the frequency and the amount of people. Everybody was hungry. Everybody.
So give me some idea of what somebody in Gaza subsists on for calories on an average day.
I would say it's changed over time. It was always rice. We ate a lot of rice, a lot of lentils, chickpeas. There is produce that's fresh. There was for a while. It tripled in price because a lot of farmland is not, there's nothing you can cultivate on it. It's destroyed, like 83%, I think.
Because of the bombing, the farmland is no longer farmable.
Yes, exactly. Because of bombing. fishing fleets destroyed. So what you have are like tomatoes and eggplants on the market, but they're so expensive, and there's not many of them. So we were eating food that we brought. I brought a whole suitcase of canned tuna that I would mostly pass out and subsist on. And there were biscuits that I think that the UN passed out for. There was still stuff on the market when I was there. I have not been there since June. It has gotten considerably worse. So now people are subsisting on the same thing I was subsisting on, but for instead of eating once a day, I've heard a lot of people are eating once every couple of days at this point. So it's catastrophic. It's become catastrophic.
And then let's talk a little bit about what used to be part of the infrastructure and how people got food, which was the UN and USAID. What have happened to those sources?
So those seem to have been done away with over time. I mean, basically Israel is sort of in charge of whatever goes in, whatever comes out. Every coordination you do is through Israel. They replaced the UN-backed system with the GHF, which is American run and also Israeli controlled. So what happened was 400 locations across Gaza became four that are barely operational, semi-daily, has a Facebook site to tell people when they're operating. If they're operating, they might not be because of security or maintenance. I've had people go and it just not be open. Also, it's just very disorganized. The UN system was, the type of system that delivered food to people, made hot meals. Like, it was really backed by local experts who really understood what their communities needed. And it was run by Ghazawis in many ways, doing the sort of heavy lifting. And now you just have these, you're replacing expertise, a lot of care, a lot of real social work, a lot of community care with men in weapons, men just sort of holding machine guns from a distance and just sort of letting aid sit there and watching people fight over it because they're desperate and hungry. It's definitely to me an obvious strategy to further eradicate a people that are on a land that other people want.
So tell me, you probably talked to people who had made that trek to one of these four sites, right? So if you force all these people away from 400 sites to four sites, I imagine the natural tendency is there's going to be a huge spike in demand, and you see these huge crowds of people waiting. What is that process like? Well, how do people describe that to you?
So I have one source who's in his mid-20s named Khalil. And Khalil told me about, I think it was mid-June that he was visiting a GHF site near the Netzarim corridor. He had gone really early in the morning. It was still dark out. And he was saying that by the time he got there, he went with his two brothers and his friends. So it was, as usual, young men who are kind of given the responsibility to sort of brave the trek. They have to walk a few kilometers. Wherever they are, they have to walk a few kilometers for sure. And there's no fuel, nor can you drive because the Israelis won't allow that. It's very dangerous. You might be targeted. So you have to walk. And you have to walk while you haven't eaten in a while. At least, even if you've had something in your mouth, I mean, it's not been a lot. It's not been a lot for the last couple of days. So imagine Khalil, who has already lost nearly 50 pounds, from what I understand, since a year and a half ago, is with his brothers and his friend. And it's early morning. There's thousands of people already there. They're, from what he told me, barefoot, and sort of just, it's intense. It's intense because people seem really nervous. They're, again, I don't think I've said this, but Gaza is loud. The quadcopters are incessant, and sometimes they're near and sometimes they're far, but they're always buzzing. They're always buzzing. And there's bombs always present. They're ever present. And they're sometimes near and they're sometimes far. So there's a lot of noise while you're doing this trek, and you're getting to these people who are intensely hungry and hoping to find a morsel of food and are willing to do a lot to get it. And I remember he told me that he was waiting in line and there was just thousands of people, and then shots rang out and he just started running. And that was his experience, basically getting in line, seeing soldiers in the distance, seeing sort of other non-Israeli soldiers maybe nearer to the aid, and then sort of waiting for it to start happening. And then before it even sort of took, even the aid distribution happened, gunshots rang out and he just started running for his life. And he said, that day I got closer to death than a piece of bread. And I thought that was a really, really sad way to have an experience with trying to get aid. Like, this is an incredibly impossible situation for someone to experience. To not only then try to get aid and then be shot at it's undignified. It has nothing to do with peace or humanitarian, sort of the humanitarian qualities of aid distribution and what they should be founded on, actually. So it was just hard to hear, and it's hard to keep talking to these people who are having just harrowing experiences on their way to trying to get food for their families.
You know, Israeli leaders for a long time, and also parts of the American press, have used this line of reasoning that Hamas has been in charge of the food that's coming into Gaza, and they have been either stealing it, or they've been destroying it, or they've been bargaining with it. And I wonder, I mean, there's a recent New York Times article that says that members of the Israeli military are now saying that they never found proof that Hamas stole the aid provided by the UN. In your time there, with the people that you spoke with, what is the role of Hamas when it comes to gathering or distributing any of the food aid that is coming into the region?
I didn't have any reason to suspect or believe that anyone was experiencing anything or much of anything with Hamas. Now, are there men in this scenario that might have worked in government or have an association with Hamas in some loose way, who are also men who are unstable at this point after 21 months of a genocide and several months of starvation? Are some of those men probably bullying other people and maybe doing that? I'm sure they are. In fact, I've heard stories of that, but they're never connected specifically to Hamas. And so my point is that I think that this is all a line. I think it's a way to skirt responsibility, to justify ethnic cleansing, to justify forced starvation. They keep blaming Hamas when it's really clear that it's almost like it's undignified for me. It's hard for me to dignify that sort of line of thinking with a response, because it just feels like it's completely made up to me. Now, I don't want to overstate and say that there's no one stealing aid or that there aren't problems, but I think that the disorganized thing with the disorganized way that GHF is handling everything is really the problem. It's not Hamas.
You are describing structurally a scenario where hundreds of people around you that you can see are visibly losing weight because they do not have enough calories in their body, right? And at the same time, there seems to be this sort of war of words. Is this starvation? Is this famine? And we kind of get caught up in that debate. And I wonder, I mean, look, we have, David Mencer, an Israeli spokesperson, he said, in Gaza, there is no famine caused by Israel. There is, however, a man-made shortage engineered by Hamas, right? That was our last question. Then you have a Prime Minister Netanyahu saying there is no policy of starvation in Gaza, and there is no starvation in Gaza. We enable humanitarian aid throughout the duration of the war to enter Gaza. Otherwise, there would be no Gazans. So what's your response to that?
My response is that we often in the West, or even not in the West, get caught up in semantics with each other as if it's important or meaningful at all. If we're even getting to the point where we're speaking about genocide or anyone starving, it's probably really very, it's just like so much later than it should be in the situation, right? Like if we're talking about genocide or whether something is starvation or if there's a policy of starvation, like, right, you can sort of like take these words and unpack them. Ultimately, people are starving right now. I've seen them. I even was hungry for the 9 weeks that I was there. And it's because of a manufactured blockade. There's an occupation. There's also people, community kitchens being there's so much destruction. There's a way where you just have to stop listening to semantics that try to parse out whether something is bad enough and understand that it's so much worse to talk about this for 21 months than to have done something a year and a half ago before this became a human catastrophe that, I don't know, probably has changed the trajectory of so many people's worlds and probably the world itself as well.
This past weekend, Israel announced that it would pause fighting for 10 hours a day in populated areas to try to allow the food aid to get in. A former Israeli government spokesperson Elon Levy said, quote, "Here are hundreds and hundreds of pallets of aid that the UN is letting rot in the sun, and instead of taking responsibility for that failure, they're blaming Israel and pretending that Israel isn't letting this aid in altogether." What did you see? Who's controlling the flow of aid into this area?
I mean, there were hundreds of trucks at the Kerim Salam border. There's no way for aid to come in or out without coordination from Israel. So again, like engaging with these sort of bold-faced, almost delusions of how this is working is hard for me, because my experience was that for me to get to Nasser Hospital, which is 20 minutes away from Deir al-Balah, I'd have to coordinate with the Israelis because it was in a red zone. So any of these red zones, you have to go through. They're in charge of what is going on. It took me 5 hours to get to Nasser and back, and it's 20 minutes away. They are occupying every possible way for any of this to be solved. So for them to sort of blame other parties makes no sense. And I don't know how else to put it, because logistically speaking, every single thing is greenlit by them. So whether there is fuel that you can take a car to Rafah and pick up whatever you need to pick up, or from whatever crossing, you would have to do that through the Israelis. If it's not getting done, it's because the Israelis aren't letting it get done.
Did the Israeli officials that you reached out to have a comment for this story?
No, they didn't. They refused to answer, and then they didn't answer our texts. So, but I think that they've commented a lot. I think that, we've talked a lot about what they've said. And to me, we've got to start listening to Palestinians a lot more, because they're telling us a lot sooner than we're listening. And then we're listening when it's almost too late.
You have the privilege of leaving.
Yes.
And I wonder, Afif, if now, even in the weeks and months that you've been home since, is there a story or a person that kind of gnaws away at you that you check in on often? Tell us about that person or that story.
Yeah, I have so many people now. I have so many people there that are suffering in a way that is unimaginable. And now I can sort of imagine it. But what I want to leave you with, I think what is important to say is that every person I met in Gaza was extremely faithful, and they were also extremely capable of being appreciative even in the hardest sort of scenario. And it's what made them capable of taking care of each other even when there was no supplies to do so. And so in the wake of my experience there, I'm trying to memorize how they lived, because we've learned a lot about how they die. And I think what's more important actually is how they've been living and what's been being stolen from them, actually. So there's a lot of stories that race through my mind all the time, and I'm texting people all day, every day. So it was an incredible experience, because I think we're struck with how sad it all is, and it is very sad. It's obviously harrowing, but it's also something I think that needs more spotlight, is the fact that these people are vibrant and alive. And that is what is so sad, is that that's being stolen as we speak.
Afif Nasouli, thanks so much for joining us and for your reporting from the region.
I appreciate you so much for having me on the show. Thank you.
From firing the CDC director to terminating research for some life-saving vaccines, RFK Jr. has been tearing apart the American healthcare system. But senators gave him a grilling at the hearing earlier today on his controversial and what most experts say dangerous decisions as health secretary. He fired back, accusing the CDC of failing to keep Americans healthy.
We are the sickest country in the world. That's why we have to fire people at CDC. They did not do their job. This was their job to keep us healthy.
And when pushed on the vital role of vaccines during COVID, Kennedy claimed incorrectly that we were, quote, lied to about everything.
We were lied to about about natural immunity. We were lied to about, we were told again and again the vaccines would prevent transmission, they'd prevent infection. It wasn't true.
Dr. Michael Osterholm is the founding director of the University of Minnesota's Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, and his new book, The Big One, examines the global pandemic and how we should prepare for the next one. He tells Hari Srinivasan why the health secretary's latest moves could spell disaster.
Christian, thanks. Dr. Michael Osterholm, thanks so much for joining us. Your new book is titled The Big One, How We Must Prepare for Future Deadly Pandemics. Before we get to what's in the book, I really want to talk a little bit about what's in the news these days. Just in August 5th, the Health and Human Services Department announced the cut of $500 million in mRNA research, which will impact 22 projects being led by big pharmaceutical companies, right? And in a recent interview there, you said, I can say unequivocally that this was the most dangerous public health decision I've ever seen made by a government body. Explain why.
Well, first of all, again, assuming that the next pandemic might very well be influenza, that's a virus that could easily kill even many more people than we saw with COVID. Our ability to respond to that really is back to vaccines. And currently, the capacity we have in the world to make influenza vaccines is limited. We use chicken eggs largely to grow the virus in. In a year to 15 months after a pandemic began, we could probably make only enough vaccine to vaccinate less than a quarter of the world. It turns out that the mRNA technology, the same we use for COVID, actually can be applied to influenza, and that it's not going to be a better vaccine in the sense that it's going to protect a whole lot more. It'll still provide that same protection we saw with the COVID vaccines, but we can make enough vaccine within a year to probably vaccinate the whole world. That's the difference in millions of lives lost. Just that one simple decision, and we need these vaccines badly for future pandemics, and right now, the likelihood of that happening is close to zero because of that decision.
As part of the rationale for these cuts, Secretary RFK Jr. said, the data shows, these are his words, these vaccines fail to protect effectively against upper respiratory infections like COVID and flu. We're shifting that funding towards safer, broader vaccine platforms that remain effective even as viruses mutate. How do you respond to that?
Well, let me put it into context. One is science. Science has given us the major improvements in health over the last 100 years that meant that life expectancy rose from the 50s to into 80-year-olds just in 1 year or 100 years. And today we have to count on science. Unfortunately, what Mr. Kennedy is promoting and sharing is, in fact, disinformation, what we really call magic or smoke and mirrors. And the public has to understand that his comments, while they may sound very professional and official, are meaningless. In many cases, they make no sense whatsoever. And so we have to continue to emphasize, if we want to maintain the kind of health protection we've had in this country and around the world and improvements on it, even when we have had great challenges with infectious diseases, we have to stick with the science. If we follow the comments, the recommendations, or the actions of Mr. Kennedy, we are doomed to see public health really denigrated greatly.
You know, back in 2017, you wrote a book called Deadliest Enemy, and it was prescient in a way. And now you've teamed up with the same co-author, Mark Olshaker, and you wrote The Big One, How We Must Prepare for Future Deadly Pandemics. And I think, you know, a lot of viewers will be surprised that your fear is not COVID-19. It's actually something, you know, worse. And you play out these kind of worst case scenarios and how we should prepare for that. Explain.
Well, when I say worst case scenario, let me just be clear. I'm not even sure that this scenario is the worst case. It's a very realistic situation. As the listeners may remember, back in 2003, we had a global outbreak of SARS. At that time, the first real coronavirus infection that caused serious illness in humans. Because that virus was not very infectious, we were actually able to suppress its transmission and stop it from being spread around. But it did kill 15 to 20% of the people that got infected. Then along came MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, another coronavirus infection in 2012 in the Middle East. And that virus then also spread to Seoul, Korea in 2015, when a visitor to Saudi Arabia returned back to Seoul with this virus infection. In those instances, the MERS virus killed actually almost to 35% of the people it infected. And so you can see the difference with what happened with COVID, where it's only about 1.5% of people died, and I say only with great regret. So the point being here is that if you had a new coronavirus that could kill like SARS or MERS, but be spread like SARS-CoV-2 or COVID, that would be disastrous. And that's what this scenario is about. Well, guess what? In just recent months, we've actually found viruses in bats and caves in China that have the ability to spread likely that of what we saw with COVID. And they also have on board the same genetic pieces that would make it possible for them to cause very serious illness with deaths potentially in that 15 to 35% range. So this is not some kind of science fiction in that sense. This is, I think, anything just a harbinger of things to come, reality that we have to deal with.
So if you could summarize, what are some of the biggest mistakes that we should be learning from COVID?
Well, first of all, we didn't understand as a society that this was going to last for 3 years or more. And therefore, we planned for it much like you might think of with a severe hurricane, where basically you find, for 12 to 18 hours, it's horrible, but you can go into recovery shortly thereafter. And so one of the challenges we had early on is that people wanted to approach this from the idea of a lockdown or closing everything down, and then we'd come back out the other end. And unfortunately, we had a number of our leaders saying that is what would happen. We, in January of 2020, actually laid out the fact that this is likely to last many years, 2, 3, maybe even 4. And we had to be prepared how we're going to handle for that. And what our real goal was should have been at least, was to make sure that our hospitals were not overrun. The one thing that could save more people's lives was to have adequate health care. But if you're running your hospital at 140, 150% capacity, at that point, you didn't really have any chance to hopefully provide better medical care. And so one of the things we propose is, rather than doing lockdowns, is to use what we call snow days, so that if in fact you are in a community where your hospital bed census is now at 100%, and you know that number every day, it's publicly made available. At that point, you can say to the public, please, for the next 10 to 20 days, we need to back off whatever we can in terms of public engagements, crowds coming together, etc., so that we can get that census down in our hospitals and hopefully provide better medical care. If we had done that, that would have made all the difference in the world in people understanding that lockdowns aren't the answer. There are a number of events just like that we could learn a lot from with COVID.
Just this last week, we had the director of the Centers for Disease Control removed by RFK Jr., and we had several officials who resigned. One of the officials in an interview said that based on what I'm seeing, based on what I've heard with the new members of the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, or ACIP, they're really moving in an ideologic direction where they want to see the undoing of vaccination. They do want to see the undoing of mRNA vaccination. What does that mean for our public health?
Well, in very simple terms, it's a disaster. We are literally watching 100 years of public health activity that has resulted in saving millions and millions of lives, potentially flushed down the drain. And it's that important for the public to understand that, because you need to be talking to your local, your national elected officials and saying, is this the kind of government that you want to provide to us? Because this is not an issue where one day we'll still have a debate, well, which one was right? I can tell you what will be right. It's going to be the science side will be right, because the numbers of people who will die because of following the same kind of ideology approach are going to become very apparent in not a too distant of a future. Again, if we had that same mindset going into a pandemic right now, it would be an utter disaster. And it's not just HHS in Health and Human Services that Secretary Kennedy heads up. Right now, there's no one in the White House, no one who is overseeing biopreparedness for a future biologic event, one that might even be man-made, meaning a bioterrorist attack or a pandemic. This is such a major, major shortcoming in our preparedness. And so I think we need to take a step back. And I just want to point out that, again, ideologically, In the first Trump administration, they did a lot of really good things to help get us better prepared for a bio-preparedness event. And I don't know why now suddenly that type of activity is frowned on, if not totally discouraged, when in fact that was the hallmark of the Trump 1 administration.
Hey, we had recently a man who opened fire at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, and he was motivated in part, I guess, by his discontent with the COVID-19 vaccine. And it leads me to kind of come back to that sort of disinformation question. I mean, you know, on the one hand of the column here, you've got scientists working with a series of facts. You're talking about, you know, efficacy and trying to communicate better. And on the other hand, the team that wants to disinform and actively, you know, engage users for their clicks, etc., they don't have to do any of that. They just have to have emotional appeals and kind of get into somebody's head. And that is pretty effective.
That's scary. And let me just tell you on a personal level, having, you know, been in the front row of the pandemic response during COVID and having received death threats, I know what the concerns are of many of my colleagues in terms of why do we do our job every day? What do we do to protect ourselves and our family members? This is a huge challenge. And in the first instance, the public has to understand what's at risk here. Is losing public health will mean that there will be many, many more outbreaks of diseases that we could easily control with vaccines or by having safe water supplies, dealing with mosquito populations that are suddenly spreading exotic viruses around the country. That's the kinds of things that public health does all the time. And if public health does its job really well, you never hear about anything because we actually prevent it from happening. And I think that's what the challenge is right now, is because we have enjoyed so much prevention from groups like CDC over the years. People say, it's not really necessary. Well, it will come back. And again, I just want to stress over and over again, we can't prepare for the big one if we're not, in fact, preparing for everyday events right now. Somebody has to call the question, are we going to continue to pursue the kind of activities that Mr. Kennedy wants us to do, that some of the public are surely willing to even bring violence to the table to deal with that issue? Or are we going to continue to maintain that science-based approach where basically we're constantly learning about these infectious diseases or other health conditions and trying to make the world a better place? Remember, no one goes into public health to get rich. No one goes into public health to become famous. People go into public health to serve. They go into public health to help. And that's, I think, the question we have right now. What is it going to take it to get us back to that norm?
Right now, our conversation so far has been focused primarily on the United States. But I also want to ask about what happens when USAID has been slashed as it has been, and what our visibility is for viruses, future pandemics overseas, because viruses don't care about borders, right? And I wonder, is there, you know, that loss of funding and infrastructure? Can you either quantify or qualify the effects that will have downstream?
We have withdrawn support, as you noted, from USAID, one of the most successful soft power efforts ever put forward by any government, not just ours, in terms of lives saved, in terms of the endearment of locals in countries around the world for the United States support, and as well as the fact we pulled out of the World Health Organization. We're no longer a member there. We actually are not part of the routine communications. We are not contributing to knowledge at WHO, but we're also not learning from it. Why is that important? Because there are so many infectious diseases, for example, that start on a distant shore and can come to our country. You know, we look at what happened in 2015-16 with Ebola in Africa and the concern we had for it getting here. By not participating on the international level, we actually shoot ourselves in the foot in terms of protecting ourselves. Borders in of themselves will not keep infectious agents from going from one country to the other. What does make a difference is stopping those outbreaks in their tracks in the countries where they begin. And so we are losing all of that opportunity. We are going to see a resurgence of HIV/AIDS. We're going to see a resurgence of drug-resistant tuberculosis. We're going to see a resurgence of malaria in areas that used to control the mosquitoes that are not now going to happen. And guess what? They're all going to land in the United States eventually. And because we live in a world where travel now is so ubiquitous, we're also going to see U.S. citizens going to countries around the world in much greater risk for being in that country than before because of this very decision to pull out of the global health arena. And so all I can say is that this, again, is a penny-wise, pound-foolish effort. We are not helping us at all. We keep talking about putting America first. This puts America last.
You're leading an initiative called the Vaccine Integrity Project. What's the need that you're trying to address with this?
Well, what we realized early on after the election was that based on the 2025 document and what the priorities were for dismantling public health, that one of the first areas to go was likely to be vaccines. And of course, with Mr. Kennedy being nominated for Secretary of Health and Human Services, we recognized that his major anti-vaccine theme was going to be carried through. Actually, in November of last year, I wrote an article in the New York Times laying out what likely could be lost in public health in the future with a Kennedy HHS appointment. And sure enough, the vaccine issues that we worried about are happening. Let me just say that at this point, it's very, very clear that the kind of things that we're seeing happen at the federal level are going to continue to happen unless we see Congress step up and begin to insert itself into this process. Remember at the time when the confirmation hearings were held, we actually had Mr. Kennedy promising to Senator Cassidy that he would not take vaccines away from anyone. Well, he did. That really brought us at our center in Minneapolis with the idea that we need to figure out what can we do to help out if, in fact, the ACIP, the Advisory Communication Practices, is suddenly done in. What roles did they play? And so we started this new initiative. And with that, we actually first did focus groups with a number of vaccine enterprise experts, all the way from research and development to the final shot into the arm, to say, what can any non-governmental organization do to help support one's there with ACIP? And one of the things we learned was, in fact, to make recommendations for vaccine use, we needed to have the comprehensive data that the ACIP used to present. Well, we picked that up. We actually, as a effort out of the VIP project, began doing a review of all of the vaccine information for COVID, for RSV, and for influenza to have it in time for this upcoming winter season. And we did the analysis where we were able to identify over 17,500 different pieces of information, articles about these vaccines. We summarized that using a very specific protocol approach. And that is now the information being used by our medical societies to determine their own vaccine recommendations. And so from that perspective, we are now providing what ACIP once did.
Founding Director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Michael Osterholm. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.